The wind carried a chill through the frontier town, and with it came whispers of cruelty that no one dared to say aloud. A young orphan girl, with nothing but the fragile hope of kindness, had knocked on the doors of the rich, seeking shelter, a meal, perhaps even the warmth of belonging. But each door closed tighter than the last, the sneers of those with gold cutting deeper than hunger ever could. She was left to wander the dusty streets, a shadow among men who measured worth by wealth, not by heart. Her bare steps echoed against wooden porches as laughter from the wealthy echoed in her ears, laughter that reminded her she was an outsider, someone to be cast aside. Yet in her silence, there was a strength, a quiet endurance shaped by nights beneath open skies and days fighting against despair. She carried nothing but the memory of love long lost, and even that seemed to grow heavier with each rejection. The West was harsh, and for an orphan girl, it could be merciless. But fate has a way of weaving threads where no one expects. At the edge of town, in the solitude of towering pines, lived a lumberjack, a man known not for riches, but for his silence and his loneliness. He had built his life with calloused hands, felling trees and crafting timber, yet within him lingered an emptiness that no labor could fill. The world had taken much from him, and in return, he had taken refuge in solitude. Still, his eyes carried the weight of someone waiting for something he could not name. When the girl stumbled upon his cabin, weary and broken from rejection, their worlds collided like flint and steel. She expected another door to close, another face to turn away. Instead, the lumberjack's eyes softened, and without words, he opened his home to her. It was not an act of pity, it was recognition. In her sorrow, he saw his own. In her longing for belonging, he felt the echo of his own emptiness. And so, while the rich had turned their backs with cold disdain, it was the lonely lumberjack who offered her the one thing she needed most, a place to belong. Not gilded halls, not fine dresses, but a home built on warmth, kindness, and the quiet bond of two souls abandoned by the world, yet found by each other. It was a beginning neither expected, and one that would challenge everything they, and the town, believed about love, worth, and the true meaning of family. The town buzzed with whispers when word spread that the orphan girl had not vanished into the wilderness as expected, but had found refuge in the cabin of the lumberjack. To the rich, it was scandalous. How could a man of rough hands and simple means dare to open his home to someone they themselves had deemed unworthy? Their pride was stung, though none would admit that what truly unsettled them was not the girl's survival, but the quiet strength of the man who had given her shelter without asking for anything in return. The girl, still fragile from her rejection, felt the warmth of something she had long forgotten: safety. The lumberjack did not shower her with promises, nor did he attempt to fill the silence with words. Instead, he offered her space at his fire, a bowl of stew from his modest pot, and the assurance that, within these walls, no one would turn her away. For the first time in what felt like years, she slept through the night without fear of being cast into the cold. Yet peace never lasts long in a land as unforgiving as the West. The townsfolk, wrapped in their own vanity, began to murmur about propriety, about appearances, about how an orphan girl and a lonely man could not possibly forge anything honorable. Their gossip traveled faster than wildfire, stoking suspicion and scorn. The girl, though grateful for a new home, could feel the eyes of judgment piercing her back each time she ventured into town. The lumberjack remained steady, unmoved by their sneers. He had known solitude so long that the disapproval of others carried little weight. Still, he understood the cruelty of whispers better than anyone. He had once been a victim of them himself. His silence, however, was not weakness. It was the armor of a man who knew the value of truth over reputation. And now, his truth was simple. The girl needed him, and perhaps he needed her just as much. One evening, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the cabin walls, the girl looked up from her bowl and asked softly, "Why did you open your door when no one else would?" The lumberjack paused, his weathered face illuminated by the flames. After a long silence, he replied, "Because I know what it feels like to have every door shut." In that moment, their bond deepened, not out of pity, but out of shared pain, and the kind of understanding that only the broken can give to one another. The days that followed brought a fragile rhythm. The girl began to help with small tasks around the cabin, carrying water, tending the fire, mending torn cloth with delicate hands that had known hardship. Though she had been rejected by the rich, she found dignity in these simple labors, for they were not demanded of her, but freely offered. With each passing day, she grew stronger, and the cabin that once echoed with silence now pulsed with the quiet hum of companionship. But outside their sanctuary, the storm brewed darker. The wealthy families, unsettled by what they saw as defiance, gathered in hushed meetings. To them, the lumberjack's act of kindness was an affront, a reminder that compassion did not come from gold but from heart. And in their pride, they could not bear to see the girl thrive where they had chosen to see her fall. They began to plot ways to undermine her, to prove that she did not belong, and that the lumberjack's defiance would come at a price. One afternoon, the girl ventured into town alone to fetch supplies. The laughter she once endured had turned sharper now, edged with cruelty. Women turned their faces, men muttered insults under their breath, and children, taught by the malice of their parents, mocked her steps. Yet she did not break. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her chin lifted, her resolve unshaken. Each act of scorn only strengthened her spirit, as though the lumberjack's steady presence had passed into her bones. When she returned, her eyes held both sorrow and fire. The lumberjack saw it at once, and though he said little, he placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm, grounding. That night, as the wind howled outside, she whispered through tears, "Why do they hate me so much when I've done nothing wrong?" His answer was simple, yet profound. Because you remind them of what they've lost, the courage to be kind. Those words sank deep into her heart, reshaping her pain into strength. As the winter crept in, the bond between them grew into something unspoken, yet undeniable. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a home built not by wealth or expectation, but by choice. And though the town continued to spit venom, the girl and the lumberjack discovered a truth the West often forgot. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in gold or power, but in the quiet endurance of two souls who refuse to let the world define their worth. The cold of winter wrapped the land in silence, but inside the cabin, warmth thrived. Each morning, the lumberjack would rise before dawn, his axe echoing through the forest as he split wood to keep the fire alive. The girl, once frail and timid, began to step outside with him, her hands clutching smaller tools, determined to share the weight of survival. She stumbled often, her body not yet hardened by labor, yet her spirit never yielded. With every effort, she proved that she was no longer just an orphan surviving the pity of others. She was part of something stronger, something real. The lumberjack watched her closely, quietly admiring the resilience that burned brighter with each passing day. He had lived years surrounded by trees, but haunted by emptiness, believing solitude was his only destiny. Yet now, the sound of her laughter, faint though it was, softened the shadows of his life. He never said it aloud, but in her presence, he felt the loneliness in his chest begin to fracture, replaced by a warmth he had long thought impossible. Meanwhile, in town, the whispers grew sharper. The rich scoffed that the girl was using the lumberjack, feeding on his kindness until she found a way to betray him. Their cruelty was not rooted in truth, but in envy that someone they had deemed worthless had found what they themselves lacked: acceptance. Their disdain turned into schemes, plotting to tear apart the fragile happiness that had blossomed at the edge of the forest. The girl knew of their contempt, but instead of cowering, she grew bolder. She walked through the town with her head high, carrying supplies with steady hands, refusing to let their stares crush her spirit. Each time she returned to the cabin, she carried with her not just food or cloth, but proof of her defiance. The lumberjack saw this courage and realized that she was not the one being saved. It was both of them, together, pulling each other from the weight of a merciless world. One evening, as snow drifted against the windows, the girl whispered a truth she had never spoken. "When they rejected me, I thought I was cursed to be alone forever. But here, with you, I finally feel like I belong." The lumberjack, his voice rough with emotion, answered simply, "This house was never a home until you walked through its door." And in that moment, they both understood that destiny had given them not wealth, but something far greater: each other. The bond between them grew unshakable, but the town's bitterness refused to fade. The wealthy saw their unity as defiance, and in their pride, they could not tolerate being proven wrong. They began spreading lies: that the girl had bewitched the lumberjack, that she was a burden draining his strength, that soon she would bring ruin upon him. Their venom reached every corner of the settlement, poisoning minds already weakened by envy. One afternoon, when the girl entered the general store, a wealthy matron confronted her with sharp words. "You don't belong here," she sneered. "You're nothing but a stray, hiding behind the pity of a lonely man." The words cut deep, yet the girl did not falter. She met the woman's gaze and replied with calm defiance, "If kindness is weakness, then perhaps it is stronger than all your gold." The room fell silent, for though her voice was soft, her words struck like iron against stone. The lumberjack heard of the encounter when she returned, her hands trembling though her spirit remained firm. He said little, but that night, he walked into town and stood silently in front of those who mocked her. He did not raise his fists, nor did he draw his axe. He simply looked at them, his presence towering, his silence heavier than any weapon. And in that silence, they saw the truth: he would not let the girl stand alone. Winter deepened, and with it, the challenges grew harsher. Food was scarce, the nights bitter, but together they endured. The girl's hands grew calloused from work, the lumberjack's heart lighter from her laughter, and in their unity, they discovered strength neither had ever known. Their home, though small and modest, became a fortress of resilience, a place where rejection had no power. But the town's envy would not rest. Behind closed doors, the wealthy whispered of a plan to drive the girl away for good, to break the bond that had defied them. What they did not know was that the girl and the lumberjack, though quiet, had built something stronger than gossip, stronger than hate. Their story was no longer about survival. It was about a love born in the harshest soil, a love that could not be uprooted by pride. The days grew longer as spring returned, bringing with it new challenges. The lumberjack's cabin, once hidden in the quiet of the forest, now felt the weight of the town's gaze. Riders passed more often than before, their eyes lingering too long, their whispers carrying back to the settlement. The girl sensed the tension building, the storm of envy pressing closer. Yet inside the cabin, life blossomed. She tended to a small patch of earth near the door, coaxing fragile sprouts from the soil, her laughter weaving through the trees like a melody the lumberjack had never thought to hear again. But the wealthy could not tolerate what they saw as defiance. Their rejection had been final in their minds, and the girl's survival was an insult to their pride. A gathering was held in the grandest house of town, voices dripping with venom. They spoke of honor, of reputation, but beneath it all lay fear, fear that their wealth could not purchase the dignity and peace found in the simple bond between an orphan and a woodsman. Their envy soon turned to resolve, and they decided it was time to break her spirit once and for all. Unaware of the schemes, the girl continued to grow in strength. Each day, she worked alongside the lumberjack, her hands blistered, her body sore, yet her heart was lighter than it had ever been. She had been given no riches, no gowns, no banquet halls, but she had something far greater: belonging. And in the West, where loneliness often killed faster than hunger, belonging was worth more than gold. The lumberjack, though silent as always, noticed the glow in her face. She was no longer the trembling orphan who had stumbled to his door, but a young woman forged by hardship into resilience. He admired her quietly, never daring to speak what his heart began to feel. For a man who had known only loss, love was a dangerous thought. Yet each time she smiled, he wondered if perhaps the forest itself had guided her to him, not by chance, but by fate. Still, the unease lingered. The birds fell silent when strangers passed too close, and the lumberjack's instincts, sharpened by years of solitude, told him danger was near. He began to prepare, stacking more wood by the cabin, checking his tools and his rifle with the precision of a man who knew peace could be shattered in an instant. What neither he nor the girl yet realized was that their greatest trial was about to begin. not against the wilderness, but against the pride of those who had once turned her away. The tension broke one afternoon when the girl returned from town, her eyes filled with both fire and sorrow. The townsfolk had cornered her in the street, their words sharper than knives. They accused her of being a burden, of bringing shame to the lumberjack, of tainting the name of the settlement by daring to find joy where none had offered her kindness. Their voices had been cruel, but what shook her most was not their hatred. It was their fear, the trembling in their words that betrayed envy. The lumberjack listened silently as she recounted the encounter, his jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, she expected anger, perhaps even regret that he had taken her in. But instead, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. "They hate what they don't understand. Let them speak. Their voices cannot break what we've built here." His calmness anchored her, reminding her that their strength was not measured by the cruelty of others, but by the bond they had forged in defiance of it. Yet the town's contempt only deepened. A group of wealthy men confronted the lumberjack days later, standing at the edge of his clearing with sneers etched into their faces. They warned him that the girl would bring nothing but ruin, that his kindness was a weakness, that he would lose everything if he continued to shelter her. Their words dripped with arrogance, but beneath their polished coats and gold rings was the brittle pride of men threatened by something they could not control, love born without wealth. The lumberjack said little, as was his way, but his silence carried more power than any speech. He stood tall, his axe resting at his side, his eyes unwavering. The men faltered under his gaze, their bravado cracking against the weight of a man who had carved his life from stone and timber. They left in anger, but their threats lingered in the air, a promise that this would not end quietly. That night, the girl sat by the fire, fear flickering in her eyes. "They won't stop," she whispered. The lumberjack looked into the flames, his face carved with determination. "Then we will endure," he answered. For in his heart, he knew that the West was not kind, but it respected those who refused to bend. And together, they were stronger than the voices that sought to tear them apart. The days that followed carried an uneasy calm, like the hush before a storm. The girl continued her work beside the lumberjack, but her eyes often drifted toward the path that led back to town, wary of what might come. She had faced hunger, loneliness, and rejection, but this was different. This was the weight of being targeted not for her weakness, but for her defiance. Still, she refused to shrink into fear. Every log she stacked, every thread she mended, was her silent declaration that she belonged. The lumberjack felt the tension as well, though he never spoke of it. Instead, he built with a new intensity, strengthening the cabin, sharpening his tools, preparing as though the forest itself had whispered warnings. He knew men like the wealthy of the town, men who hid cruelty behind polished words, who believed kindness was weakness and silence was submission. But he also knew something else. The strength that came from protecting what mattered was greater than any force born of pride. In town, the whispers turned into plans. A group of men, too proud to admit their envy, began to conspire openly. They spoke of restoring order, of teaching the lumberjack his place. Behind their words lay one goal: to rip the girl away from the life she had built, and to prove that their rejection was final. Their wives, though silent, watched with unease. Some pitied the girl, others feared the scandal, but none dared to speak against the tide of arrogance swelling in their homes. One evening, as dusk bled into night, the girl sat by the fire and finally spoke the fear that had grown within her. "What if they try to take me from here?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her resolve. The lumberjack looked at her, his eyes calm but unyielding. "Then they will learn what it means to face a man with nothing to lose," he replied. His words were not a threat, but a vow, quiet, steady, and final. For the first time, the girl allowed herself to lean against him, her heart beating fast but steady. In his silence, she felt a strength that no wealth could buy, a fortress built not of timber and stone, but of loyalty and love. The storm was coming, they both knew it, but together they would face it, not as orphan and outcast, but as two souls bound by the unshakable truth of choice. The storm broke on a cold morning when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet of the clearing. A group of men rode toward the cabin, their faces grim, their voices sharp with false righteousness. They dismounted with heavy steps, their boots crunching against the frost as they approached. The girl's heart pounded, but she did not hide. She stood in the doorway, her chin raised, while the lumberjack stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the snow. The men began their accusations, claiming the girl was a burden, a danger, a disgrace to the town. Their words, laced with venom, echoed in the crisp air. But as they spoke, the girl felt something shift within her. She no longer heard the cruelty as truth. It was envy wrapped in insult. And for the first time, she did not feel powerless against it. She felt stronger, because beside her stood someone who had given her a home, not out of obligation, but choice. The lumberjack, as always, was silent at first. His hand rested on the handle of his axe, not raised in threat, but steady, a reminder of the strength that lay behind his quiet nature. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unshakable. "She is not yours to scorn, nor mine to command. She is here because she chooses to be, and no man alive will take that from her." His words fell like thunder, silencing the jeers, cutting through the pride of men and used to being defied. The leader of the group sneered, spitting into the snow. "You'll regret this, woodsman," he growled. But his voice wavered, his certainty cracking under the weight of a man who had carved his life from solitude and suffering, and who now stood unbreakable with someone worth protecting. One by one, the men faltered, their bluster shrinking against the wall of silence and conviction standing before them. As they retreated to their horses, muttering threats they no longer believed, the girl felt a rush of tears, not of fear, but of relief. She turned to the lumberjack, her voice breaking as she whispered, "No one has ever stood for me before." He met her gaze, his expression as steady as ever, but his words carried a depth she would never forget. "Then let this be the first, and never the last." The forest slowly reclaimed its silence after the men rode away, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The girl sat near the hearth that evening, her hands trembling though her spirit had not been broken. She replayed the scene again and again. Their cruel voices, their sneers, the threat of being dragged back into loneliness. Yet, stronger than all of that was the memory of the lumberjack's words, his unshakable presence. For the first time, she felt not only sheltered, but defended. The lumberjack moved about the cabin, tending to the fire, checking the locks, sharpening his axe. To anyone else, these would seem like ordinary tasks. But the girl understood. They were preparations. He had lived long enough to know that men driven by pride seldom retreated forever. She watched him in silence, her heart heavy with gratitude, knowing that his solitude had taught him endurance, but it was their bond that now gave him purpose. Meanwhile, in town, the men who had been shamed in the clearing nursed their wounded pride. Their wives questioned them quietly, asking if it was worth provoking a man who had nothing to lose, but the men only hardened their resolve. Their authority had been challenged before the eyes of the settlement, and they could not bear the weight of humiliation. They spoke of restoring order, once more, blind to the truth that their fight was not about justice, but about envy of a bond they could not understand. The girl sensed their return was inevitable, but she no longer trembled as she once did. Her strength had grown alongside the lumberjacks, forged in hardship, nurtured in kindness. As she worked the soil near the cabin the next morning, she whispered to herself, "They may hate me, but they will never take from me what I have found here." Each word was a vow, a shield against the cruelty she knew was still to come. That night, as snow fell softly outside, the lumberjack finally broke his usual silence. "You've given this place life again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you, these walls were nothing but wood. Now they're a home." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, the pain of the past faded. Whatever trials awaited them, she knew she had found what the wealthy had denied her all along, love that asked for nothing but truth. The final test came with the dawn of spring, when the men returned once more, this time not with jeers, but with force. They rode hard into the clearing, determined to tear apart what they could not control. The girl stood in the doorway again, But this time she was not the trembling orphan who had once been cast out. She stood tall, her shoulders straight, her eyes burning with defiance. She was ready, not because she had grown invincible, but because she was no longer alone. The lumberjack stepped forward, his axe glinting in the morning light, his silence louder than the shouts of the men. They hurled accusations, called him a fool, a disgrace, a man blinded by pity. But their words no longer carried the same weight. The people of the town had begun to see through the lies, whispers of admiration spreading for the orphan who had stood against rejection, and for the woodsman who had given her dignity. What had started as scorn was turning into quiet respect. When the men demanded the girl leave, she spoke before the lumberjack could. Her voice, once fragile, now cut with the force of steel. You cast me aside when I had nothing. You call me worthless, a burden. But here I am, standing, stronger than I ever was, because I was given a chance. You cannot take from me what you never gave me, home. Her words silenced even the boldest of her enemies, striking them with a truth they could not deny. The lumberjack then placed himself between her and the men, his expression calm but immovable. You've had your say, he told them quietly. Now leave. And though they bristled with anger, they felt the weight of a man who would fight to the end for what was his, not out of greed, but out of love. One by one, they turned their horses, retreating not in victory, but in defeat. The West respected power, and that day it bowed to something greater, loyalty and love unbroken by pride. When silence returned to the clearing, the girl and the lumberjack stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts steady. The world had tried to break them, but instead, it had revealed their strength. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light on the cabin that had once been only wood and stone, they both understood. They had not just survived the West. They had redefined what it meant to endure it. In the end, the tale of the orphan girl and the lonely lumberjack was never just about rejection or shelter. It was about resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of choosing kindness when the world offers none. The West, with all its dust and cruelty, tried to break them, yet in defiance, they built something unshakable. Their story reminds us that strength is not always measured by wealth, by status, or by force, but by the courage to open a door when every other one has been shut. The girl, once abandoned and forgotten, discovered that her worth was never defined by those who cast her aside. Her scars became her armor, her voice became her weapon, and her defiance turned into a beacon for others. She was no longer simply an orphan. She became proof that even in the harshest lands, love and belonging can grow where no one expects. Her journey was not about being saved, but about being seen, and in being seen, she learned to stand unbroken. The lumberjack, hardened by solitude and silence, found in her the piece of himself he had long buried. His life, once carved only in wood and stone, was transformed by a simple act of compassion. By choosing to protect rather than abandon, he rediscovered purpose. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, revealed itself to be the strength of a man who needed no words to prove his devotion. Together, they taught that true power lies not in conquering others, but in lifting another's soul from despair. And the town, though stubborn and proud, was forced to face a truth it could not deny. Gold may build walls, pride may build rules, but neither can match the force of two hearts bound by choice. The whispers of scorn that once filled its streets turned into murmurs of respect, for deep down, even those who rejected her longed for the courage she displayed and the loyalty he showed. Their story became legend, carried on the wind as a reminder that compassion can endure where cruelty fails. If this story touched you, let it remind you of the value of standing by those the world has overlooked. Share in the comments what part of this journey resonated most with you, because your voice can inspire others just as hers did. Like this video if you believe that kindness is stronger than pride, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that carries the spirit of the West into your heart. Together, we can keep these voices alive, ensuring that tales of courage, love, and resilience are never forgotten.